Welcome everyone, this is Amer from UCounsel. Today we'll talk about the law of dismissal for cause in Canada. We'll cover some basic topics so you can understand the fundamentals of this concept. Essentially, the dismissal for cause occurs when an employer believes that employee has done something wrong and he or she deserves to be dismissed immediately from employment. We'll begin with the usual disclaimer that this course is not legal advice, so if you have any specific questions, you must contact a lawyer or paralegal. So what is just cause for dismissal? It is essentially employee's misconduct, and the misconduct is so bad that the employee deserves to be terminated immediately. So when a court is making a decision about whether a particular dismissal was justified as just cause or was it a wrongful dismissal, the court considers the circumstances in a contextual way. It's called the contextual approach, and this is something that you want to keep in mind. What I mean by that is, I'll explain it with an example. Let's say if an employee was employed for about 15 years with an employer, stellar record, no disciplinary issues, and one day the employee ends up disobeying his or her supervisor or manager, or speaks improperly about it in a derogatory manner or something like that, which is completely out of fashion, out of line with the proper employee conduct. Does the employer have a right to dismiss the employee for cause? And the employer may think that this one incident is sufficient to dismiss for cause, but when the court is looking at this conduct, the court is going to look at the entire 15 years of record to see how the employee behaved in 15 years, what kind of conduct he had with his managers and other employees and whatnot, and the specific circumstances of this particular incident, and then decide whether the decision to terminate him for cause was justified or not. So it's a contextual approach, and it looks into a variety of circumstances before a decision is made. So one thing that if you want to remember one thing about dismissal for cause, you want to remember this. Dismissal for cause is considered the capital punishment of employment law. In other words, what employee has done is so bad, is so egregious, so heinous, that he deserves the highest punishment in employment law, which is dismissal for cause. So these are not sort of small incidents, these are not small instances of misconduct, but something that is really, really harmful, something really egregious. And so in majority of circumstances where the employer actually claims dismissal for cause, when the cases are tried at court, majority of the time the court does not find dismissal for cause unless the conduct that was alleged was so egregious that it deserved dismissal for cause. So we'll talk about it in a bit more detail by giving you some examples. So let's get into 5 things that I have indicated that you may want to keep in mind. What happens to an employee's rights when he or she is dismissed for cause? Keep in mind that when an employee is dismissed for cause, there are no termination rights, no post-termination rights. So he or she does not get any termination rights, termination pay, severance pay, nothing, no severance, no reasonable notice, common law reasonable notice that employees without cause termination may be entitled to. The terminated employee for cause does not get any of those rights, and the employee is not even entitled to employment insurance because it's a dismissal for cause. So what you want to keep in mind is that A, there are no sort of post-termination rights, but the pre-termination rights are intact. And what I mean by that is whatever salary, benefits, commissions the employee has accrued up to the point of termination, he or she will still be entitled to that. But post-termination, he or she will not be entitled to any rights. Point number 2, single incident. So what I mean by that is whether a single egregious incident of misconduct amounts to dismissal for cause, and the answer is yes, it could be sufficient. So going back to our example of 15 years service employee who conducted himself improperly. So let's take the same employee who had a stellar record for 15 years, and then at some point in the present, he steals large amount of money for the employer, or some money from the employer. That may be sufficient despite his or her 15-year good conduct to justify dismissal for cause. So in majority of the cases, when somebody has worked for such a long time and has had no disciplinary issues or had no misconduct issues of that nature, then it's unlikely that he or she will be found to be an employee deserving of dismissal for cause. But the point that you want to remember is that a single incident can amount to dismissal for cause, and you want to keep that in mind. So violence at work, a significant violent issue at work may justify a dismissal for cause. What about infractions that are cumulative? By this, what I want you to understand is that there could be series of incidents. I can quote you an example. For instance, ongoing absenteeism, or coming late to work, or leaving early from work. If this kind of behavior is ongoing for a long time, and employer has been issuing warnings, and the employee has not been heeding to all kinds of warnings, and so all of this may cumulatively amount to dismissal for cause, and the employer may be justified. So just because the infractions are not too significant, the fact that they have been repeatedly happening, and the employee may have been receiving warnings for that, that may amount to dismissal for cause as well. What about progressive disciplining? And we get this question often when an employee is terminated for cause, and he or she comes to us and states that he had never received any warnings or any suspensions, and therefore the employer is not justified in terminating the employee for cause. And that may not always be the case. Progressive discipline is not necessarily a prerequisite to termination for cause. I mean, it depends. One of the factors it may depend upon is the employer's workplace policies. If the employer has workplace policies that require the employer to issue warnings and require the employer to provide progressive disciplining to the employee before terminating him or her, then you may have an argument that progressive disciplining was a prerequisite. But generally speaking, prior warnings or previous suspensions are not a requirement. It really depends upon the conduct, and the court is looking at the entire context of that conduct to decide whether the dismissal is justified for cause. Let's talk about some of the examples of just cause dismissal. Stealing, embezzling money from employer obviously is an example of where the dismissal for cause would be justified. Violence in workplace harassment, including sexual harassment of co-workers, other people. Sometimes violence and harassment outside of work may lead to dismissal for cause from employment. So this is an area that's constantly changing and expanding, and one needs to be mindful of that. Disobedience, obviously, of lawful orders may amount to dismissal for cause. Discrimination of co-workers, other employees, or the employer may cause dismissal on just cause basis. Some of the examples where the dismissal may not be justified, one of the common examples is performance issues. A lot of times we get cases where employer has terminated an employee for just cause because the employee could not meet the performance metrics. I can tell you in majority of the cases that performance is not considered an element of just cause dismissal. Performance is something that the court believes that if the employer, it is the employer's job to do due diligence to make sure that they have hired an appropriate employee who is able to perform based on their requirements. So if they are unable to meet the employer's standards, then the employer can terminate them without cause, but terminating with cause is not something that's commonly acceptable. What about meeting targets? Now, a lot of companies, they provide certain targets, sales targets, objectives that an employee must meet. And when the employee is not able to meet those, sometimes the companies try to terminate the employee for cause, and that's also not generally acceptable. The court will consider that the employer can terminate the employee without cause, but not meeting targets is generally not considered grounds for dismissal for cause. Other minor infractions, I can give you different examples. Occasional coming to work late, or occasional absenteeism, which sometimes may be justified, sometimes may not. Rude behavior with your coworker, occasional rude behavior, or with your superior. These kind of things, the mistakes that are sort of human mistakes that may happen just because of being in workplace and working with other people, those may not amount to just cause dismissal. If somebody is not a liked person based upon his or her behavior with others, then the employer has always this inherent right to terminate an employee without cause, and that's the direction that the court prefers the employer to take. So just what you want to keep in mind about dismissal for cause is that it is the capital punishment of employment law world. So someone has to have done something so bad, so egregious, that the without cause dismissal is not an appropriate remedy, and they must be terminated with cause. And second thing you want to keep in mind is that the approach that the court takes is contextual. They look at a number of factors in deciding whether in the specific circumstances of that case what the dismissal for cause was justified or not. So if you're ever faced with dismissal for cause, my suggestion is to contact an employment lawyer, have them review your circumstances so they can advise you whether you have a case for wrongful dismissal or not. Hopefully this helps you understand the fundamentals of dismissal for cause. If you need any explanation of any points, or you have any other things that you want us to talk about, by all means contact us and we'll be happy to add in our future lectures. Thank you for watching.